In 1874, an innocent orphan fed her master's desires, but what he did next darkened her soul forever. Under the dim glow of a flickering oil lamp, the old house of Willow Creek seemed to breathe. Its wooden bones groaned under the weight of a century's secrets, and somewhere within its walls, an orphan girl once whispered prayers no one ever heard. It was 1874, a year when silence could kill faster than any disease, and obedience was the only form of survival left for those without a name. Her name was Elsie. Barely 16, with hands cracked from scrubbing stone floors and eyes too tired for dreams. They said she was lucky, taken in by the wealthy Montgomery family after the orphanage fire. But luck, as she would learn, is a cruel disguise for damnation. Each night, Elsie served tea to her master, Mr. Montgomery, a man whose wealth dripped from his words and whose shadow seemed to stretch longer than the room itself. He spoke softly, too softly, as though kindness could erase what lurked beneath. The town called him a man of God, a benefactor, a saint, but behind the velvet curtains, the truth was much darker. One night, as rain clawed at the windows and thunder swallowed her breath, Montgomery's voice cut through the storm. "Elsie, come closer." That single phrase marked the end of innocence. And what followed, the things he made her do, the way he made her feel small, would twist her spirit into something unrecognizable. They say a soul can only be broken once. But what if it isn't broken? What if it learns to remember? Because years later, when the house stood empty and the Montgomery name faded from town records, people still swore they heard a girl's hum echoing through the halls at night. A lullaby so sorrowful that candles would flicker out on their own. No one ever stayed long enough to finish listening. Tonight, we'll uncover what really happened inside that cursed house. We'll open the letters no one dared to read, the ones that tell how a girl's pain became something eternal. And believe me, no one was prepared for what they discovered. Stay until the very end, because the final revelation about Elsie's fate was hidden for over a century. And it's something I promise you've never heard before. If you believe that some histories are too dark to remain buried, this one will test how much truth you were willing to face. The year was 1874, a time when the air in rural Louisiana carried both the sweetness of magnolias and the rot of something unspeakable. The Civil War had ended less than a decade earlier, but its ghosts still lingered in every field, every prayer, every man who pretended not to see the suffering around him. The Montgomery estate stood on the edge of that world, a grand house with white pillars and black secrets, surrounded by acres of sugarcane that whispered when the wind passed through them. From a distance, the mansion was beautiful, the kind of place that appeared in paintings or whispered legends told at the local chapel. But up close, the paint peeled like old skin, and the windows seemed to watch. The servants said the house never slept. They spoke of footsteps on the upper floors, even when Mr. Montgomery was away, and of a cold draft that passed through the hall just before something terrible happened. The world outside the gates was shifting. Freedom had been promised, but for many, it was a word without meaning. Children orphaned by war filled the streets of small southern towns. Churches tried to take them in, but poverty devoured mercy faster than sermons could be spoken. That's where men like Richard Montgomery found their opportunity, cloaked in generosity, offering food and shelter, while their true intentions remained hidden behind smiles and scripture. Elsie was one of hundreds, nameless, voiceless, chosen because no one would ask about her once she disappeared. The orphanage that took her in was built from rotting timber, run by nuns who had long since lost their faith. When Montgomery arrived with his gold ring and charming words, the sisters handed the girl over with trembling relief. "A man of God," they said. "He'll give her a home, The carriage ride to Willow Creek was long, cutting through forests where the trees leaned so close they seemed to whisper warnings. The road was muddy, the air heavy with decay. And yet, somewhere inside her, Elsie still believed this might be the start of something kind, that maybe, just maybe, God had heard her prayers. When the gates of Montgomery's estate swung open, the illusion shattered. The air changed. Colder, quieter. The house loomed like a cathedral to someone's sin. Servants avoided her eyes. The butler spoke in half sentences, and when she asked where Mrs. Montgomery was, no one answered. At night, the world inside the mansion was a study in shadows. Candles burned low, oil lamps hissed softly, and the floors whispered beneath unseen feet. There was a room at the top of the stairs that no one entered, locked from the outside with iron latches. Sometimes, when the wind rose, Elsie swore she could hear crying coming from behind that door. Not the sound of pain, but something worse, the sound of someone begging to be forgotten. The town of Willow Creek avoided the subject of the Montgomerys. People crossed themselves when their name was mentioned. The local pastor refused to bless their land, and every time a new servant was hired, another would vanish without explanation. But it wasn't until Elsie's arrival that the house began to change. Or perhaps that's when the house finally woke up. There were whispers in the walls, scratches that appeared overnight, a mirror in the dining room that fogged only when Elsie entered. The servants began to say that she had brought something with her, something from the orphanage fire that still clung to her like soot. The deeper she walked into that house, the more the line between the living and the dead began to blur. And outside, in the endless Louisiana night, thunder rolled over the fields like an ancient warning. Something inside Willow Creek was watching her, waiting, and soon it would reveal itself. Elsie had never known what it meant to belong. Her earliest memories were of the orphanage, damp walls, cold porridge, and the sound of rain dripping through a cracked roof. The nuns called her the Quiet One, because even as a child, she rarely spoke. When others cried, she simply stared into the distance, tracing shapes on the frost that crept across her window at night. But silence is not emptiness. Silence remembers. By the time she arrived at the Montgomery estate, she had learned to survive by reading faces, to sense danger in a twitch, a smile, or the way someone's voice softened before turning cruel. When she first met Mr. Richard Montgomery, she thought she saw kindness. He looked nothing like the men who shouted in the orphanage courtyard or the soldiers who passed through town. He was tall, with silver hair and a voice so calm that it almost made her forget her fear. "Do as you're told," he said gently, "and you'll never be without." He gave her a room upstairs, small but clean, with a window overlooking the cane fields. For a moment, Elsie believed she had found a place where she could rest. The other servants, mostly older women with downcast eyes, treated her kindly at first. There was Martha, the cook, who hummed hymns under her breath while stirring soup, and Daniel, a quiet stable hand who always slipped Elsie extra bread when no one was looking. They were the first people to make her feel seen. But in the Montgomery house, kindness was always followed by fear. Mrs. Montgomery was long gone. Some said she'd died of fever, others whispered she'd run away. Yet the master's bedroom remained untouched, as if she might return at any moment. Elsie wasn't allowed near it. Still, she felt drawn to the heavy oak door at the end of the hall, where the air always smelled faintly of perfume and ashes. At dinner, Mr. Montgomery prayed aloud before every meal. His words were perfect, practiced, but his eyes never reached heaven. When he looked at Elsie, the prayer always paused. The silence that followed was suffocating. One evening, as she cleared the dishes, he asked her to stay behind. "You remind me of someone," he said, his voice low. "Someone who once trusted me completely." His hand brushed against hers, not by accident. Her body froze, her breath locked inside her chest. From that night on, something shifted. He began asking for her presence more often, in the library, the garden, the candlelit parlor, after everyone had gone to bed. Always with the same smile, the same soft tone that hid the hunger beneath it. Martha warned her in whispers, "Don't ever go to him alone." But in a house where orders were law and refusal meant punishment, Elsie had no choice. She learned to endure in silence, to hide the tremor in her hands, to wash away the bruises before dawn. She clung to the smallest moments of humanity, Daniel's quiet nod from the stables, the sound of birds outside her window, the way the morning light touched the fields as if the world beyond the estate was still pure. At night, she began to talk to the darkness, to whatever listened beyond the veil of the living. She spoke softly, asking for strength, for forgiveness, for escape. Sometimes she thought she heard an answer, a faint whisper behind her, a breath that wasn't her own. Elsie was no longer just a servant. She was becoming part of the house, or perhaps the house was becoming part of her. And deep inside that mansion, under the watchful gaze of its walls, something began to stir, something that would soon turn her pain into power. It began with the sound of dripping water. At first, Elsie thought it was the rain, steady, rhythmic, echoing faintly through the floorboards above her bed. But when she opened her eyes, the night was still. The storm had passed hours ago. The air was thick with silence, heavy enough to make her ears ache. The dripping continued. Tap, tap, tap. Each drop sounded closer, like it was crawling down the wall. She lit her small oil lamp, the flame trembling, as though it feared what it might reveal. The sound was coming from the far corner of the room, behind the wardrobe. When she pulled it aside, the wallpaper peeled away, revealing dark stains that trailed down like veins. The smell hit her next, metallic, faintly sweet, blood, but old, years old. The next morning, she tried to tell Martha what she'd seen. The older woman's face went pale, and she pressed a trembling finger to her lips. "Don't speak of such things, child. The walls have ears in this house." Elsie wanted to believe it was just a trick of her imagination, that the stains were something else. But that night, when she returned to her room, she found something new. A message scratched faintly into the wooden floorboards beneath her bed. "Help her." The letters were small, carved with something sharp. She touched them, half expecting them to vanish, but they were real, etched deep into the wood. Her heart pounded as she scanned the rest of the room. The message looked old, the grooves darkened by dust. Someone had written it long before she came, but who? She began to notice more, little things that hadn't been there before, or perhaps she had never seen them. A torn ribbon tucked behind the fireplace, a child's silver comb, blackened with soot, a faint perfume that lingered in the hallway whenever she passed the locked door at the end. That door, the one no one ever opened. Sometimes she thought she heard movement inside, a shuffle, a sigh, the creak of floorboards. Once, she swore she saw a flicker of light beneath the crack, as though someone were walking inside with a candle. But the key to that room hung from a hook in Mr. Montgomery's study, and he never left it unattended. The house seemed to pulse with unease. Even the servants moved differently now, whispering in corners, avoiding eye contact. Daniel, the stable hand, stopped meeting her gaze entirely. When she tried to speak to him, he muttered something under his breath, a prayer or maybe a warning, and walked away. That night, as the wind howled through the cane fields, Elsie dreamed of fire. She saw herself standing before the locked door, the words, "Help her," glowing faintly on the walls. A voice whispered from the other side, pleading, trembling, a woman's voice, calling her name. When she woke, her lamp had gone out. The air was freezing, and on the inside of her window, written in condensation, was a single word, one that hadn't been there before. Remember. Elsie didn't scream. She simply stared, breath trembling, as the faint outline of her reflection blurred against the glass. For the first time, she realized the truth. The house was alive, and it wanted her to find something. From that night on, nothing in the Montgomery house felt real anymore. The walls that once seemed still now breathed with quiet sounds, sighs, soft knocks, the shuffling of unseen feet. The servants avoided Elsie entirely. Martha stopped leaving bread by her door. Daniel, who once smiled, now crossed himself whenever she passed. The air carried a weight, as though the house itself was watching. And Mr. Montgomery, he seemed to sense her fear and feed on it. He called for her more often now. "Elsie," he would say, his tone gentle but sharp underneath. "You've grown distant. Are you hiding something from me?" She wanted to tell him about the stains, the whispers, the writing. But his eyes were the kind that demanded silence. He would never believe her. Or worse, he would. Punishments in the Montgomery house were never spoken of, but everyone knew. A maid who broke a vase once vanished before sunrise. A gardener who tried to leave was found 3 days later in the river, his mouth full of mud. People said the master's money reached even into the sheriff's pocket. So the town stayed quiet, and those who worked for him learned to pray in secret. Elsie's prayers, though, had changed. They were no longer for mercy, but for understanding. She began to feel that the voice calling her from behind the locked door was more than a ghost. It was something familiar. Late one evening, while polishing the study shelves, she noticed the old brass key, the one that opened the forbidden room, was missing from its hook. Her hands trembled, but curiosity burned hotter than fear. If there was something hidden in that room, something that could explain the horrors of the house, she needed to see it. She waited until the house fell silent, then crept upstairs. Every step felt heavier than the last. The door stood at the end of the hallway, tall and black in the candlelight. She pressed her ear against it. Nothing, only her own heartbeat. But when she placed her hand on the latch, the air grew cold, unnaturally cold. Her breath came out in visible clouds, and then she heard it again, a faint humming, the same melody she had heard in her dreams. Before she could open it, a voice spoke behind her. "Elsie!" Mr. Montgomery stood in the shadows, candle in hand. The flame flickered across his face, making his smile look carved rather than real. Curiosity is a dangerous trait in a servant. She froze. He stepped closer. "That room," he said softly, "is not for you." His tone was calm, almost kind, and that made it worse. "It holds memories best forgotten. Obedience, Elsie, is what keeps you safe." He reached out, brushing her cheek with the back of his hand. "I took you in when you had nothing. I fed you, clothed you. Don't make me regret it." She wanted to scream, to run, but her voice betrayed her. He turned and left, locking the door behind him, the echo of the latch sealing her fate. That night, she lay awake, shaking. The dripping had returned, louder now, closer. When she looked toward the wardrobe, she saw moisture seeping through the cracks in the floor. The stains were spreading again. Elsie pressed her hands against the boards. Beneath them, something moved, something alive, and in that moment she understood what true injustice felt like. Not just the cruelty of one man, but the silence of a world that allowed it. The house had trapped countless souls before her, but this time it had chosen someone who refused to stay quiet. The next morning, Elsie awoke to find muddy footprints outside her door, small, bare, and leading away, as if a child had walked the hall during the night, but no children lived in the house. The sight froze her blood. The prints trailed toward the forbidden room, stopping just before the locked door. She stared for a long time, half expecting them to vanish. Instead, the air around her thickened, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic. All day she tried to focus on her chores, but her hands shook so violently that Martha scolded her for spilling water across the floor. The older woman's voice cracked with fear rather than anger. "Elsie," she whispered, "don't go near that door again. You hear me? There are things in this house that were never meant to be found." But Elsie could no longer pretend. The stains on her walls were spreading like veins beneath her fingers. The humming followed her now, faint but constant, a woman's voice, low and mournful, threading through the air whenever she was alone. That night, she gathered what little courage she had and returned to the second floor. The hall was dark, lit only by the pale light of a dying moon through the windows. The locked door stood before her again. The brass key was gone, but the old hinges looked brittle. She found a fire poker in the parlor and pressed it between the latch and frame. With a groan and a shudder, the door finally gave way. The smell hit her first, a blend of mildew, dust, and rot. The room beyond was small and windowless, with faded wallpaper the color of bone. In the center stood a single chair, and beside it an iron bed frame covered with a tattered sheet. She lifted the cloth slowly. Beneath it lay a bundle of stained linen and something far worse, shackles bolted into the wooden floorboards, their edges rusted and worn from years of struggle. Her breath caught in her throat. She knelt, tracing the marks etched into the wood, deep grooves, as if someone had clawed at them with broken nails. Among the scratches she could make out faint words. "Don't forget me." The humming grew louder. Elsie turned, heart pounding, and saw movement in the mirror hanging crooked on the wall. For a moment she thought it was her reflection, but the face staring back wasn't hers. Pale, hollow-eyed and bleeding from the mouth, a woman's face, older, with a sorrow so vast it seemed to swallow the room. "Elsie." The mirror cracked. Elsie stumbled back, her lamp crashing to the floor, oil spilling across the boards. The flame flared up, and for a heartbeat, the room glowed bright enough for her to see the rest of the carvings on the wall. Names. Dozens of them. Women's names. Each one followed by a date, and every date ended the same way, the year of their disappearance. She grabbed the sheet and smothered the flame before it spread. The smoke clung to her skin, bitter and acrid. Behind her, the cracked mirror whispered faintly, as though air passed through it. She leaned closer. "Elsie." The voice was clearer now, the same voice from her dreams, the same voice that had called from behind the door. She ran from the room, down the hall, trembling, tears blurring her vision. But when she reached her quarters, something new awaited her. On her pillow sat the child's silver comb she'd found days before, polished clean, and beside it, a folded piece of parchment. She opened it with shaking fingers. Scrawled across the page in hurried, uneven ink were 4 words that made her stomach twist into knots. He did it again. The truth was no longer buried in whispers or walls. It was alive, reaching for her, calling her deeper into the house's memory. And for the first time, Elsie realized she was not alone in her suffering. The house wasn't just haunted, it was keeping score. The note in her trembling hands would not stop shaking. He did it again. The words were written in a jagged, desperate hand, as if whoever wrote them had done so in terror. Elsie stared at the parchment until her eyes blurred, her breath shallow. Someone had known. Someone before her had tried to warn the world, and failed. She hid the note beneath her mattress and returned to her chores, though her body moved as if detached from her mind. Every sound in the house now carried meaning, the creak of the stairs, the whisper of fabric behind her, the faint humming from the locked room she had broken into. Nothing felt still. Nothing felt safe. That evening, Mr. Montgomery called for her. His voice carried through the hallway, low and commanding. "Elsie," he said, "come to the study." When she entered, the room smelled of tobacco and old paper. He was seated at his desk, his hands clasped together, a faint smile curling his lips. "You've been restless lately," he said. "I see it in your eyes. Have you been wandering where you shouldn't?" Her throat tightened. "No, sir," she whispered. He leaned forward, his gaze heavy. "Lying is a sin, child." He stood, walking slowly around the desk, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. "You see, this house remembers. It always tells me when someone disobeys." Her knees weakened. I don't understand." "Don't you?" he asked softly. "Then allow me to remind you." He opened a drawer and took out something wrapped in cloth. When he unrolled it, Elsie saw a small silver cross. Its chain broken, its surface blackened. Her heart lurched. It was the same cross she had seen in her dream, the one the woman in the mirror had worn. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. He smiled. "It belonged to my late wife, or one of them." Before she could speak, he placed the cross on the table. "The women who came before you," he said, his tone almost tender. "They didn't listen either. They tried to escape what was meant for them, and the house, this house, has a way of keeping what's mine." Elsie's pulse hammered in her ears. "You're lying." His expression darkened. "Am I?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Tell me, Elsie, did you ever wonder why the servants fear you, why the air changes when you pass? This place chooses. It's not me who traps you, it's the house." He turned his back to her then, dismissing her as if she were a ghost already fading. "Leave now," he murmured, "and pray the walls forgive your curiosity." She fled before he could see her tears. That night, unable to sleep, she returned to the mirror in her room. The crack that had split it earlier now stretched wider, jagged like an open wound. She ran her fingers across its surface. For a moment the reflection shimmered, not as glass, but as water, and in that trembling reflection, behind her own frightened face, she saw something move. A figure standing in the corner of the room, a woman pale and silent, holding the silver cross. Then the whisper came again, louder this time, urgent and pleading. "He never buried us." Elsie turned, but the room was empty. She stared at the mirror once more, heart racing as new words began to appear across its cracked surface, drawn by invisible hands. "Under the floor." The message pulsed faintly in the candlelight, and Elsie understood. The house wasn't just speaking, it was giving her instructions. Whatever was hidden beneath the floorboards would change everything, and this time she would not turn away. Elsie waited until the house fell silent, until even the crickets outside seemed to hush. The message on the mirror glowed faintly in the moonlight. Under the floor. Her hands shook as she lifted the loose plank near her bed. Dust filled her lungs as the old wood groaned, revealing a hollow space beneath. At first, there was only darkness. Then her fingers brushed something soft, fabric. She pulled it out slowly, a bundle wrapped in faded lace. Inside she found letters, dozens of them sealed with wax and bound with a red ribbon. Each one was addressed to a different name: Clara, Abigail, Rose, Miriam. The same names she had seen carved into the walls of the locked room. Elsie's heart pounded as she unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was delicate but frantic, the ink smeared by tears. "He says the Lord forgives him, but I know he does not. He prays over me as he sins. If this letter is found, please tell my sister I am still here. He keeps us in the room above the chapel. He says we are angels, but angels should not bleed." Her stomach twisted. She opened another, then another. Every letter told the same story, different women, the same cruelty. Montgomery's charity was a veil for abduction and torment. The orphanage had been his hunting ground. He promised salvation to lost girls, then locked them away, one by one, until they vanished entirely. The truth seeped through the paper like poison. Suddenly, a faint sound came from the hallway, the click of boots on the floorboards. She snatched the letters, shoving them back under the plank just as the doorknob turned. The door creaked open. Couldn't sleep. Montgomery's voice was smooth as silk, but the way his shadow stretched across the floor made her blood run cold. "You've been restless, Elsie. I can hear your heartbeat from the hall." She forced a trembling smile. "I wasn't feeling well, sir." He stepped closer, candle in hand, his eyes gleaming. "The others said that too, you know, before they tried to run." The flame wavered as he leaned toward her. "Do you ever wonder why no one remembers them? Because this house has a gift. It swallows memory. Soon you'll forget as well." When he left, locking the door behind him, Elsie collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. But in that suffocating silence, something stirred beneath the bed. A whisper, faint and broken, rising from the hollow space she'd uncovered. He buried them beneath the chapel. The words didn't come from her mind. They came from below. She crawled back to the plank, pressing her ear to the opening. A sound met her. Distant, muffled sobs, as if dozens of voices cried out from deep within the house. It wasn't imagination, it was memory, alive and aching. In a burst of resolve, Elsie took one of the letters and hid it inside her apron. She would find the chapel and whatever lay beneath it. The next morning, she made her way there under the guise of cleaning. The small chapel sat at the far edge of the estate, its white paint flaking, its altar draped in dust. The air inside was suffocating. She knelt as if to pray, but her eyes were fixed on the floorboards. Beneath the altar, a patch of wood looked newer than the rest, replaced perhaps to hide something. Her hands trembled as she pried at the seam with a broken candle holder. The wood splintered, revealing damp earth beneath. The smell of decay hit her like a wave. Bones, small ones, a fragment of cloth, and half buried among them a rosary that still shimmered faintly in the dim light. Tears blurred her vision. She covered the hole, trembling uncontrollably. The letters had been the truth. Every single word. Montgomery's lost wives, his rescued orphans, his angels, all buried beneath the chapel where he preached forgiveness. When she rose to her feet, the chapel air shifted, heavy with unseen presence. Candles flickered to life on their own, one by one. And then came the voices, not screams, not cries, but whispers of gratitude. "You found us." Elsie clutched her chest, unable to breathe. The house had chosen her for a reason, and now it demanded justice. That night, thunder rolled across the valley, and the storm that had been threatening for days finally broke loose. Rain lashed against the windows, and the old house of Willow Creek seemed to awaken, every beam groaning, every door trembling as if the walls themselves were remembering. Elsie knew she couldn't wait any longer. The truth beneath the chapel was not the end of the story, it was only the beginning. She sat on the cold floor of her small room, the single stolen letter clutched in her hands. Montgomery had gone to town that evening for a church gathering, leaving the servants locked inside as always. But the padlock on the side door of the chapel she'd noticed earlier had rusted just enough to yield to force. She could escape, or she could end it. Lightning flashed, illuminating her reflection in the mirror, pale, shaking, but with eyes that no longer belonged to the frightened orphan who arrived months ago. They belonged to someone else now, someone who knew what lay buried under the prayers, under the polished pews, under the lie. She grabbed the candle, the letter, and the small rosary she had taken from the grave, and she walked toward the chapel through the storm. Inside, the air was thick and electric. The crucifix above the altar swayed gently, its shadow flickering like a heartbeat. Elsie knelt where she had dug before. But this time, she didn't dig. She prayed, not to God, not to the man who claimed his name, but to the girls whose names she had read in those letters. Clara, Abigail, Rose. Miriam, she whispered. I found you. I'm sorry it took so long. The ground beneath her trembled, not from thunder, but from something deep within. The candles burst to life again, their flames bending inward as though drawn toward her. Then from the earth, a faint glow began to rise, soft, pale, and pulsing. One by one, ghostly figures took form, fragile as smoke. Young girls, their faces calm, their eyes hollow but kind. They surrounded Elsie in silence. And among them stood another, older, familiar, the first matron of the orphanage, Sister Agatha, whom everyone believed had died in the fire. Child, the apparition said, voice trembling like wind through glass. He burned the orphanage to erase us, to erase what he had done. You were his final offering, the last name on his list, but you remembered, you heard us. Elsie's tears fell freely now. He said God forgave him. Sister Agatha's expression darkened. There are some sins even heaven won't take. The chapel door slammed open. Montgomery stood there, soaked by rain, his eyes blazing with fury. "Elsie!" he roared. "Step away from that altar!" She turned, clutching the rosary to her chest. "I know what you did." He stepped forward, candlelight twisting across his face, the face of a man who had spent a lifetime hiding behind sanctity. "You know nothing. Those girls were sinners, tainted, corrupted. I purified them. I gave them grace. You killed them," Elsie whispered. "You buried them under God's house." Montgomery's hand shot out, striking her across the face. She fell to the floor, blood on her lip. But when he reached for her again, the air changed. The candles flickered violently and a cold wind swept through the chapel, extinguishing the flames all at once. Then whispers, dozens of them echoing from beneath the floor. "You promised salvation. You promised light. You promised peace." Montgomery froze, his eyes wide. "No!" he breathed. "No, I set you free!" The ground beneath him cracked, dust rising in thick clouds. The whispers grew into wails, then into screams. The boards split open, and from the earth pale hands reached upward, dozens, clutching, pulling. Elsie crawled backward, her eyes wide with terror as Montgomery struggled, his voice breaking into raw hysteria. "Forgive me. I am your shepherd. The floor gave way beneath him. His scream was swallowed by the earth, cut short by a sound like snapping wood. Then silence. The wind died. The chapel was still. Elsie trembled, staring at the hole. Slowly she crawled to the edge. All that remained was Montgomery's rosary, half buried in the soil, its beads blackened as if burned. The ghostly figures stood quietly behind her. Sister Agatha approached, placing a hand over Elsie's heart. "You did what we could not. The house will remember peace now." The spirits began to fade, one by one, until only faint motes of light remained, rising toward the ceiling and dissolving into the stormlight that filtered through the cracks. Elsie was alone again, but not afraid. As dawn broke, the storm finally passed. She walked out of the chapel barefoot, the earth still damp beneath her feet. Behind her, the old house loomed, quiet at last. Years later, when travelers passed through Willow Creek, they would find the house abandoned, its windows boarded, its doors sealed shut. But sometimes, on quiet nights, if the wind blew just right, they swore they could hear a girl's voice from inside, soft, steady, humming a lullaby. And though no one dared to enter, the legend remained that the ghosts of the Montgomery house no longer wept. They watched. And the orphan who freed them still kept vigil, guarding the line between the living and the damned. Years later, the name Elsie faded from official records, her existence reduced to a faint scribble in a ledger now half devoured by mold. Yet the story of what happened at Willow Creek refused to die. It whispered through generations like a confession carried on the wind, not just of one girl E.S. torment, but of a time when power wrapped itself in faith and called its cruelty divine. In the years that followed the storm, the chapel rotted and collapsed into itself, leaving behind only its stone foundation and a hollow iron cross leaning against the earth. Locals avoided the hill, saying that the air there was too heavy, that prayers turned to ash in their mouths. But a few brave souls, historians, seekers, wanderers, climbed the slope to leave flowers for the forgotten. Each visit revealed new names carved into the remaining stones, none officially recorded, all written by trembling hands. And still, no one could explain how, after that night, the rain in the valley seemed different, as if it washed away more than dust. The fields bloomed again, and the families who once served under the Montgomery estate found work, homes, and a quiet dignity that had long been denied them. The curse, it seemed, had lifted, but its lesson remained. The story of Elsie became more than a ghost tale. It became a mirror, a reminder of how innocence is often destroyed by the hands of those who claim to protect it, how history's greatest horrors were not always committed by monsters in the dark, but by men who prayed loudly in the light. Some historians argue that Elsie never existed, that the Montgomery Chapel fire and the supposed disappearances were mere folklore twisted over time. But others, especially those who have read the hidden letters and seen the faint fingerprints still embedded in the chapel's foundation, know better. They say the soil remembers, that even when history tries to bury truth, the earth keeps it close, waiting for someone brave enough to listen again. What makes this story so haunting isn't the ghosts, nor the screams, nor the storm. It's the echo of recognition, the realization that power, unchecked, always repeats itself. That even today, countless Elsies still exist in forgotten corners of the world, feeding their masters' desires, their stories untold, their justice delayed. And that's why remembering matters. Because every forgotten soul invites another tragedy. Every erased name becomes an open door for cruelty to return, disguised once more as righteousness. If you've listened this far, perhaps you feel it too. That ache in the chest, that chill behind the eyes. It isn't fear, it's memory. The kind our ancestors begged us not to lose. So when someone tells you ghosts don't exist, tell them about Willow Creek. Tell them that sometimes the dead don't come back to scare us. They come back to remind us what we've allowed to be forgotten. If you made it this far, you've heard every whisper, every scream, and every secret that the walls of Willow Creek tried to keep buried. And now you're part of the few who know what truly happened there. The twisted devotion, the silence of the innocent, and the price of pretending not to see. But before you leave this story behind, ask yourself one question. How many more tales like this are still buried in history, waiting just like Elsie's to be unearthed? The truth is, the past doesn't stay silent for long. It lingers in the dust, in the hymns, in the quiet corners of forgotten towns. Every time we tell one of these stories, another lost voice gets to speak again. That's why what we do here matters, not for the ghosts, but for the living. Now, I have a challenge for you. If you believe stories like this should never fade away, type in the comments. History remembers. Let us see how many of us are still listening. How many of us refuse to let the truth be buried again? And if you're new here, or if this story stirred something in you, a chill, a thought, a question, then you belong with us. Because this community doesn't just watch history, we unearth it. Together, we drag the forgotten back into the light, where they can finally be seen. So go ahead, hit subscribe, tap that notification bell, and stay close. Because next time, the story I'll tell might be even darker. Maybe it'll make you question what you thought you knew about faith, justice, or mercy. And for those who stay until the end, I have something special coming, a hidden letter connected to this very story, a real piece of the past that ties everything together. But only those who stay to uncover it will know its secret. So, are you ready to keep digging? Then type it below. I'm still listening. Because the dead may rest, but their stories never do. The wind over Willow Creek has quieted now. The chapel's ruins are swallowed by vines, the graves hidden beneath wildflowers. Time has softened the edges of everything, except the story. The story remains, like a scar on the land. And if you stand there long enough, when the moon is full and the air turns cold, you might hear it again, the faint sound of a lullaby carried by the wind. They say it's Elsie's voice, that she still walks between the stones at night, not as a restless spirit, but as a guardian, a keeper of the truth that almost vanished. And maybe that's what all ghosts are in the end, memories that refuse to be erased. But as the years pass and people forget again, new whispers begin to rise. Whispers of another place, a small coastal town where the sea glows red once a year, and no one knows why. Some say it's a natural phenomenon. Others believe it's something older, something tied to the souls lost at sea and the covenants written in salt and blood. That's where we'll go next. To the edge of the Atlantic, to a forgotten fishing village where the ocean itself seems to remember sins long drowned. Before you go, take a breath. Look around you. Every object, every photograph, every shadow in your home carries a history, quiet, unseen, waiting. The world is full of ghosts. Most of them don't scream. They whisper. And as long as you keep listening, their stories will keep finding you. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "I guard the memory." Because that's what this community is now. The memory keepers. The ones who don't look away when history turns dark. Next time, we'll open another door that's been locked for too long. Another story that was meant to stay buried. And when we do, I promise you, the light we find won't comfort you, it will haunt you. Until then, stay curious, stay brave, and keep the lantern burning. The shadows are waiting, and the next mystery is already calling your name.